Thank you for coming. I'm your host, Elizabeth Zargis, and these are my thoughts on change management, especially concerning common barriers to change and methods for de-escalating the conflict that can arise around change. I have prepared this presentation for the Business 501 course on strategic management taught by Dr. Marie Downing, and am delivering this presentation on May 2nd, 2021. Based on my reading of Chapter 13 of Michael Cafferty's Management, a Faith-Based Perspective, I have selected 3 of my experiences with change in the workplace. I will discuss what barriers made change difficult in each of these situations and share my thoughts on the most difficult barrier to overcome. I have included ideas from 2 supplemental resources, a Slack blog post and an Inc. article about de-escalating the dysfunctional conflict that can arise as organizations pursue change. I closed by discussing the wisdom of the Christian approach to conflict management and how following that model, even in secular workplaces, can function to preempt conflict escalation from the start. Since 1999, I have worked as a communications professional for Christian organizations. 3 times in my career, I have participated in change management in Christian organizations. In Wheaton, Illinois, I worked for a megachurch situated in the heart of the city. The church had outgrown its facility by far, but was landlocked in its current situation. The surrounding county offered very few options for relocating the church, and church leaders presented a plan to purchase 47 acres 7 miles away from the church's original location. The cost of the land alone was nearly $9 million, but many attenders struggled more with the emotional costs of moving away from our beloved downtown location near Wheaton College and into a more diverse part of the county. When I worked for an international church denominational headquarters office, their much-loved president, who had served for more than a decade, retired. The ensuing campaign led to the election of a much more conservative president, polarizing the mostly progressive staff. At a Christian university where I worked, we faced a leadership transition, culture fragmentation, and a pandemic during my tenure. Cafferty describes 4 barriers to change: benefits of stability, calculated opposition, mental blinders, and systemic obstacles. I experienced these to varying degrees at the organizations where I worked, although I believe that I experienced systemic obstacles the least. All 3 organizations were adept at change on a smaller, more incremental scale when necessary, so the systems that were in place were not overly entrenched. The benefits of stability played a huge role at the megachurch in Wheaton. Many longtime attenders of the 75-year-old church believed that the church should plant a smaller church for newcomers so that the old-timers could stay in the building where all their memories were. They feared the disruption of the comfort of their routines. Fear of disruption of stability was also at work at the denomination as the new leader threatened radical change. At the university, there had been little stability for some time, so that was not a factor there. Mental blinders were more important at the university, where various factions were entrenched around favorite issues such as cost, diversity, and the threat of changes diminishing academic freedom and the importance of the liberal arts in education. At the denomination, many of the progressive staff seemed to have mental blinders for the more positive aspects of the character of the new conservative leader, who passionately focused on issues of women's equality, the value of being a multi-ethnic church, and the importance of the Holy Spirit. But because he would not allow the church to move toward affirming gay life and marriage, many progressives refused to see any of the good things he brought to the table. I personally find calculated opposition to be the most difficult of these challenges, so we turn to it next. As Cafferkey relates, calculated opposition is destructive because it involves power, influence, and overt, outspoken opposition. Usually it acts to protect the status quo, but I have also seen it used to effect change. People who pursue such opposition often have well-articulated reasons, reasonable fears, and legitimate trust issues. They tend to be true believers in their cause, and they sometimes resort to well-organized underground campaigns that garner a lot of support before the leadership is even aware that they exist. At the church, the calculated opposition rallied around two messages. This will hurt our relationship with Wheaton College, and we should spend this money on missions, not on ministry to ourselves. The leadership faced this opposition with excellent communication about the vision for growing beyond a college church and the fact that building campaigns tend to increase, not decrease, a church's overall giving to missions. At the denomination, the calculated opposition focused on predicting an impending church split and brain drain that was actually quite unlikely. Most of the very vocal opposition still work for the denomination 3 years later, so they and the rest of the organization must have come to terms with the new administration, although two key leaders did move on. At the university, the opposition was less calculating but more insidious. It grumbled under its breath but failed to organize into a cohesive force to fight the change. Many opposition leaders were let go, but so was I, and I was on the team working on the change. The best tactic I saw for dealing with the opposition was not to show fear. When the opposition would bring up their points, we would affirm the people who shared the concerns, but gently refute their arguments with a steady vision and good supporting data. Good skills in conflict de-escalation can help preserve relationships for the future, despite differences of opinion. And I'm sorry, my dog is having an itch fest right now, which you can probably hear. In looking at all the conflict de-escalation advice in all my sources, I saw 4 strong themes. The first was to create space for yourself to process. Take a step back. Challenge yourself not to react right away until you've had some time to think. Next, it was important to empathize even when you disagree. So practicing empathy, practicing compassionate listening, and communicating were important. And then understanding the context and relative importance of the issues at hand. Evaluate all the implications. Adjust your response for something big versus something small, or something that's a long-term issue versus a short-term issue. And then lastly, do take preemptive measures. Work to agree on ways to prevent conflict escalation in the future. Set parameters around appropriate conflict. I believe that one of the greatest gifts a Christian manager can give a secular workforce is the New Testament method of conflict resolution. As Cafferkey writes, the Bible's direction is to first attempt resolution by speaking to the other party in private. How often would conflict be nipped in the bud if instead of going and talking to everyone else about the problem we have with Mike, we just went to Mike and talked it out? I currently have 2 teenage boys living under my roof, and I cannot tell you how helpful it is just to sit them down in the same room and tell them to talk to each other instead of each complaining to me about the other. Although there is great wisdom in this approach, it doesn't always work. Sometimes we must resort to step 2, which Cafferkey describes as taking 1 or 2 others from the community with you to attempt a resolution. Our goal in each step should be to preserve relationships and the health of the community more than our own interests. Unfortunately, I can't say that I have seen this method used very consistently, even in the Christian organizations where I have worked. One place I worked, I won't say which, had what I'd call a slam the door and whisper approach to conflict management, which not only escalated real conflicts, but birthed imaginary ones as well. When I suggested that this approach was unhealthy, I was castigated for not allowing people the emotional space for quote-unquote healthy venting and advice seeking. At another place, when I suggested that a colleague and I each bring a mediator of our choice so that we could meet safely together to discuss a conflict, the colleague responded that she had no interest in meeting with me under any circumstances. When my manager asked the president for help, we were told simply to avoid putting me on any teams with this other colleague. So even in Christian organizations, conflict avoidance seems to be the norm rather than conflict management. However, I believe that all managers need to have one response memorized. When a subordinate or colleague begins to complain about someone, simply ask, "Have you tried talking with him or her privately about this?" A couple of my early mentors were really good at whipping out that question anytime I started to vent or process. It always took the energy out of my complaining spirit and refocused me on the value of maintaining good relationships in spite of conflict. Almost all relationships can be redeemed. In fact, I managed to make peace with the colleague who wouldn't meet with me when I sent her a cartoon of two paper clips who had managed to work out an office conflict. There is great redemptive power in good conflict management, and the only way forward is together. Thank you for your time and attention.